Welcome back. Today's lecture is on ethical egoism. So, suffering exists in the world, right? Every year, 5.9 million children die for reasons that could have been prevented. Uh, better health care or food, things like that. Um, and meanwhile, we all, maybe we didn't know the exact statistic. We're all sort of aware that something like this is going on, that there's a lot of suffering out there. And still live our lives, right? It doesn't paralyze us. We even go out and we spend money on things we don't really need. We'll go to the movies. We'll buy the new iPhone. We'll go eat out when we could make a sandwich at home. So given these two facts, you might ask yourself, why don't we feel compelled to donate whatever extra money we have to save some of these lives, right? These children that are dying, and instead we spend it on stuff that's not necessary for us. Do we really believe that our luxuries are more important than life and death for some other person? Most of you, would probably say, well, no, right? Um, I'm not that self-absorbed, right? Yeah, I know I should do better. I should do more. I know I'm sort of sometimes, right? But the fact is, most of the time you don't really think about it because these aren't people that are very close to you. They're sort of statistics to you. Um, Most of you, I assume, are pretty decent people, and if there was a hurt child in front of you, you would certainly stop and help them, right? You're not a psychopath. Yet we do seem to be in this situation in the modern world where, we're aware of all of the suffering, and yet on some level we feel like we can't just put our entire life on hold, even though, yes, of course, terrible things are happening out there, right? We feel like there's limits to what we can do or should be required to do. So, you know, nonetheless, right, even though most of us do sort of live our lives in the face of sort of being dimly aware of all this suffering, most of us would still agree, yeah, I mean, I should do more, I could do better. It would be morally good of me, maybe even morally required of me to try to help the less fortunate. You can save someone's life and it's not going to sort of cause a great deal of harm to you, then most people would say, yeah, you should do that. You should help other people. Ethical egoism, which was the ethical theory we're going to discuss right now, is actually a very different sort of view from most people's everyday instinct of morality, right? But it does make sense of why we pay more attention to our own interests than to those of starving children on the other side of the world. Most of us aren't, necessarily ethical egoists, but it does sort of provide some sort of answer to the way we actually, right? Some sort of explanation of the way we actually behave. We'll explain it. But ethical egoism, here's what it is. It's the claim that your moral duty, your only moral duty, right, your only ethical obligation is to pursue your own interests. All you need to do what's best for you. So, the ethical egoist has a very easy answer to the problem of suffering, on the other side of the world. You don't have any responsibility to save those people, right? Unless it would be in your interest to do so. You know, it doesn't stop you from saving a hurt child if it makes you feel good or makes you look good in front of other people. Um, then by all means do it, right? But the only reason to do it would be if it's in your interest. So before we explore sort of whether ethical egoism is actually a plausible moral theory or even an attractive one, it might sound pretty, bizarre at first glance. We should distinguish it from a different claim, right? That might easily be confused with ethical egoism. And this is a view called psychological egoism. So ethical egoism is the claim that we should pursue our own interests, right? It's a moral claim about what we ought to do. Psychological egoism is the claim that, as a matter of fact, because of the way our brains work, we always do pursue our own interests. We just can't avoid doing what's in our own interest. These are distinct claims, right? One is about what we should do, and one is about what we in fact do. So it's not an ethical claim, psychological egoism. It's a claim about human psychology, the motivation for our action. But the reason I'm talking about it is because it does have moral implications, right? So if it's true that the way your brain works requires you to pursue your own interests all the time, then it might be sort of pointless to take this class or to explore any ethical theory that would require you to act in the interest of others, right? To sacrifice yourself or give of yourself. If your brain simply won't let you do that, then it'd be an interesting theory, but pretty much useless for us as humans, right? So we should explore the question of whether psychological egoism is true, right? If it turns out it's true, maybe we should cut this class short. So, do people ever act from purely unselfish motives? If they do, that would refute psychological egoism, right? Psychological egoism is a scientific theory. It makes predictions, right? It claims that we always act in our own interest. All you would need to refute that theory is one false prediction. Find one person that doesn't act in their own interest. Psychological egoism is false. Well, it seems like that should be pretty easy to do. We'll take one example, right? Uh, in 1939, we're back in World War II, right? There's a Swedish man. His last name is Wallenberg. Um, And he was so distressed by what was going on in Nazi-occupied Hungary, right, with these, rounding up Jewish people, sending them to concentration camps and murdering them. Sweden was sort of neutral at the time, right? He was pretty safe in Sweden, but he decided to move to Nazi-occupied Hungary, right, and set about making it his life's work to help these. He would arrange these Swedish protective passes for Jews, and he saved many lives, managing to get them out of Hungary and get them into Sweden. Um, this was dangerous for him. He often risked his life, right? He frequently put himself in between Jewish people and Nazi soldiers. Um, and ultimately, he kind of disappeared, and we assume that he was eventually killed by the Nazis. So he risked and lost his life, right? Went from a relatively safe situation into extreme danger to help other people. So is this not altruism, right? Doesn't this one example alone refute psychological egoism? I mean, he's not alone. There were many people just in World War II, right? Gentiles or non-Jewish people, at least 22,000 who engaged in similar sorts of risky actions to Jewish people. Um, and even today, right, millions of people give blood, volunteer at homeless shelters, volunteer at hospitals, to read to the blind, and so on. Lots of people engage in charitable, altruistic behavior, right? Um, Even sometimes very wealthy people, right, will give away their entire fortune. Um, Even working class people, people that make very little money, will often save money so that they can contribute and help others. So it's not just all we need is one example, right, to refute psychological egoism, but it seems like the world is thick with examples, right? There are so many people that are engaging in actions. Um, so, case closed, right? Can we move on? Psychological egoism false? Well, not necessarily, right? The psychological egoist is can be fairly clever with their theory. So, suppose the psychological egoist could save their theory by saying this. Look, let's look at Wallenberg, right? He left Sweden and he went to Hungary to help Jews. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to do that, right? If he hadn't wanted to do that, he wouldn't have done it. So he did what he wanted to do. What's so special about that? Are we supposed to be praised for doing what we want? Isn't that just what everyone does all the time, right? Isn't that how psychology works? You have certain desires to do things, and then you go act and you do them. Is this some special thing, or is this just not, normal psychology? um, Maybe, right? So on this interpretation, someone who gives to charity is no more or less selfish than someone who, uses that money to buy jewelry for themselves, right? They were both just acting according to their own wishes. The one person wanted to give to charity, the other person wanted some jewelry, and they both did what they wanted. Um, so, is the psychological egoist correct, right? Is all altruism just doing what you want? And so all altruism is actually just selfish? Well, you could respond, and uh, it's going to get tricky, right? I discussed before the tennis match that goes on in these arguments, right? And this one's going to go fairly deep. And so practice keeping track of this, right? Because at the very end of it, it's a place where you could say something original, right? And write a paper on it. So we have, right, psychological egoism, the claim that we only ever do our interests. We have objection that says, look at all this altruism in the world, right? And the response back from the psychological egoist is no, everyone's just doing what they want. Some people want to be generous, some people want to do what you want, not altruism, not special. You might respond to that and say, look, it's not actually the case that everyone always does what they want. Sometimes you don't want to do the altruism, right, the generous thing, anyways, because you know that you ought to do it, right? Um, so, for example, right, you promise your friend that you'll help them move, right? Then the day comes, right? Maybe you're a little hungover and you're hanging out and you're like, I really don't want to move. But nonetheless, you keep the promise. Right? You didn't want to keep that promise. You weren't doing what you wanted. You were doing what you thought was the moral thing to do, right? If you go and help your friend move that couch. So that's a way to respond to the psychological egoist. No, we don't always do what we want. Sometimes we do what's right, even though we don't want to. But at this point, the psychological egoist might come back, right? And might say, no, you're still doing what you want. What you want to do is the moral thing, right? So, yeah, sometimes there's some conflict. You more than one desire. You kind of don't want to move a couch, but more than anything, you want to do the moral thing and you do that thing, right? So, again, the psychological egoist could interpret what's going on as simply doing what's in your interest. Right? And then you could respond back to the psychological egoist, right? And say, well, that's all we wanted out of morality, right? Is for you to want to do the right thing. That's the morally commendable thing, right? They have desires that aren't self-interested, right? They have desires that are altruistic, and that's what being moral is, right? That's not selfish. That's not egoism. Here's another sort of version of psychological egoism, and it's captured by this little vignette about Abraham Lincoln. So there was a story, it was reported in a newspaper in the 1800s. Um, and it's Abraham Lincoln sort of making an argument for psychological egoism in a different way. So in the story, he's on a train, right, taking a train to somewhere. He's having a conversation with somebody, and he's arguing that people are always motivated by self-interest. He's arguing for psychological egoism. Um, then he looks out the window. He hears this sort of distressed winking, right? And he kind of looks out the window and he sees a mother pig in distress because her piglet's stuck in the mud, right? And so Lincoln says, "Hey, stop the train!" He jumps out, saves the piglet, right? Gives it to the mother. Gets back on the train. The train keeps going, and his neighbor that he had just been arguing with says, "I thought you were arguing that everyone does only motivated by self-interest. You were just save that pig, right? That was altruistic. That wasn't selfish, was it?" And Lincoln replied, he said, "Oh no, that was entirely selfish. I wouldn't have been able to sleep tonight thinking about that poor piglet, right? So I rescued the pig to save myself the pain." Right? So this is something that the psychological egoist can kind of always do, right? Which is reinterpret the motive. You do something that looks completely altruistic but not self-interested, and they'll find a way to reinterpret it, right? You're doing it because it makes you feel good. You're doing it because you wanted to do it. So, it's obvious that, yeah, on the surface level, it seems like there's tons of selfless action out there, right? But the psychological egoist can always turn around and say they can interpret it as being selfish in some way, right? So maybe Wallenberg, back in World War II, the Swedish guy, he wanted to be a hero, and that was like made him feel good about his image, and it saw saving the Jews in Hungary as his chance to be a hero. You know, whatever, Mother Teresa, or pick anybody that you think has done a lot of selfless, altruistic work for the poor. Maybe she thinks she's going to be rewarded in heaven, right? Or maybe it just feels good to do morally good things, right? So it seems like you can always reinterpret these motives. But the opponent of the psychological egoist could say this, right? And I've lost track of how many moves deep we are on this little tennis match, right? But you can always intervene at any point in your paper and say, that response didn't seem to make sense to me, and here's a better response, or here's why it doesn't work. But again, we're arguing back against the psychological egoist. And you might say, look, we have all kinds of motives going on in our head. Some are selfish, some are selfless, right? Maybe more than one is happening at once, right? I want to do a morally good thing. Maybe I don't want to move your couch, right? But I want to do the right thing. But I also want to seem like a good guy that would do the right thing. And maybe later it'll make me feel good, right? So You've got all these motivations going on. And what matters is which motivation is the one that caused the action. And you could say sometimes, right? And it only needs to be true once, really, for psychological egoism to be false. The desire, right? The motivation that caused the action was a selfless one, right? If those exist at all, then sometimes you're acting. And additionally, sometimes it seems like there are cases of altruism where there's no selfish motive at all because, at least at the conscious level for the person, there's no motives at all, right? So here's an example from 2007. Here's Wesley Autry. He's standing by the subway, right? And he sees someone fall into the train tracks. And in a split second, he just jumps in front of an oncoming train, pulls the person to safety, right? Risking his life. But he manages to save the person and himself. And so, this is a very dramatic rescue. And, the newspapers, people are talking to him afterwards. They're like, what was going through your mind at the time? He's like, nothing. I just saw someone who needed help and then I helped them, right? So at least at the level of his right conscious mind, there wasn't any motivation, right? The extra motivations about it would make me feel good or I wanted to do the right thing. It was just, who needs help? I help them. He didn't even think about his risk to himself. And that kind of rings true to us, right? We're doing stuff all the time. And what are our motivations? I mean, we're not necessarily thinking about, oh, this is this going to make me feel good if I do this, right? If I go to class and I get an A or whatever, and is that going to make me feel good at the end? We're just kind of doing all this stuff because we want to do the stuff, right? Um, we're pursuing the degree because we want the degree, not because having the degree will make us feel good, right? Yeah, we do feel good at the end of it. That's not like the goal, right? So that psychological egoist strategy, that Lincoln explains. Oh, I do moral things because it makes me feel good. Most of the time we don't. We do stuff because we want the stuff, not necessarily the feeling that goes with it. Not always. Sometimes we're chasing the feeling, but that's actually relatively rare, right? We're usually focused on the world. Um, so I'm not saying that argument for psychological egoism has been resolved, um, but hopefully we've made enough room to say, look, it's not obvious that psychological egoism is true, right? There's lots of arguments against it. Psychological egoist has responses, and the argument may go on, for decades, but at least there's enough room for doubt that we can set it aside and keep going with this class, right? Again, if I said psychological egoism, we knew it was true, then like, why are we even doing this? There's enough doubt that we can keep doing this. So let's look at some of the arguments now for ethical egoism, right? Moving from psychological egoism, the psychological theory about um, how we actually act, and this ethical theory about how we should act. So ethical egoism is the claim that we always should pursue our own interests, right? That's the right thing to do, your own interests. That makes it a moral theory. Now, it's not the claim that you should pursue your own interests in addition to helping others. It literally says your only moral obligation is to help yourself. You have no duty to others. But also, it doesn't say that you can't help others. You should avoid it. Hey, if your interests happen to line up with someone else's, then great, right? I've got a kid, right? I do a lot of things for my kid that I don't always necessarily feel like doing. Um, but it's in my interest to have my kid's life work out well, and it all lines up, right? And so it's fine to help somebody else. It's also in my interest. Even if I were an ethical egoist, it would be fine to, right, a lot of stuff for my kid. We should also be clear on what counts as in your interest, right? Ethical egoism is not the claim that you just do whatever you want to do in the moment or whatever feels good in the moment. So what's in your interest is a little bit more objective than that. Right? It's not saying that you should just shoot heroin all day just so you feel good and not think about the future. What's in your interest is in the long term, what's best for you, right? Overall. So, the ethical egoist will say, we endorse selfishness, not foolishness, right? Interested person can have a long term view and think about what's best for them in the. So the first argument for ethical egoism is the argument that altruism is self-defeating. Uh, on the next slide, we'll have the actual argument with the premises and conclusion. Here's some sort of motivation for with this argument. The idea is that altruism, selflessness, is not as great as it seems. So, for example, number one, you are the best qualified person to pursue your own interests. Try to help others. You don't know them that well. You don't know anyone as well as you know yourself, and you're just as likely to mess up helping them and end up hurting them, right? Or at the very least, you'll not do as good a job as they would of acting in their interests. Right? Know them as well. No one knows, right? So that's one reason to think that yeah, I shouldn't help other people. They should really be helping themselves. They're the best themselves. They know themselves. Another point against altruism and in favor of egoism is that people often don't want you messing around to help them, right? They can often find it rude or offensive, presumptuous if you're trying to, come in and say, "How can I give you some charity?" If you ran into me on the street and said, "Oh, hey Nate, hey, thanks for being my professor. Hey, I know you guys don't make that much money. Here's $10 a lecture." I don't know. I might find that a little insulting, right? Um, so you can imagine that, yeah, that's plausible. Sometimes people don't want your altruism. And number three, to treat somebody as requiring your charity degrades them. It doesn't help them. The idea is that what you can do for somebody is preserve their dignity and respect by letting them help themselves. Everyone, ideally, best case, wouldn't want to have to take charity. Would want to get through life on their own uh, merits, right? So, maybe you don't agree with these, right? Maybe you want to argue against them, but at least they're, plausible claims that would hold true in some, if not many, cases. All right, so here's the actual argument, right? Now that we've sort of hopefully softened you up a bit for this argument, giving you examples of why altruism is maybe not all it's cracked up to be. Um, here's the argument. Number one, we ought to do whatever will promote everyone's best interests, right? Number two, and this would follows from all the reasons on the last slide, the best way to promote everyone's interests is for each person to pursue their own interests, right? Everyone knows themselves the best. They know what's in their interest, how to get it. Everyone would much rather be able to get what they want out of life without other people's help and charity. It would make them feel better about themselves and more confident and so on, right? Therefore, conclusion number three, each person should pursue their own interests, right? It's the best way to get what we want. But of course, there are problems with this argument. Yes, get used to it, right? There'll be problems with all the arguments we consider here. Um, So the tricky thing about this one, we saw that premise one was the assumption that the goal of morality is for everyone what they want, everyone's interest. And then it just turned out in premise two that the best way to make everyone happy um, was for each person to pursue their own interests, right? So premise one is actually the contradiction of ethical egoism, right? Premise one says everybody's interests matter, right? And we should take care of everybody. And it just happens that the best way to do that is for everyone to take care of themselves. Um, but it gives up on ethical egoism, right? It just says ethical egoism is the best way to make everybody happy. And our real moral theory is that we want everyone's interests to be taken care of. So they argue for ethical egoism by giving up on ethical egoism. Now, there's another argument. This one comes from Ayn Rand. You have a passage from her in the assigned readings, so you should look at that. And I may post a shorter lecture about Ayn Rand's argument. Because if you read the passage, it ends up being slightly different than the way it's presented here in Rachel's. So this version is wrong, right? But often these texts are kind of can be interpreted in many ways. So she was really a novelist. She was kind of a conservative, wrote Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. So she wasn't like a professional philosopher, uh, but she was an ethical egoist, and she did offer a kind of argument for it. Uh, her idea was that altruism denies the value of the individual. Um, the ethics of altruism, right, treating altruism as the most important thing in ethics makes the purpose of living your own life just to sacrifice it for others, right? Now, she doesn't mean dying when she's sacrificing, but she means sacrificing your interests and goals to further other people's goals, right? And, that's a plausible interpretation of what in a moral way seems to be about, right? Yeah, you do kind things for others, even when it, costs you. But she thought that was actually a terrible approach to life. And here's why. She thinks that the individual life has this special value. Um, the way I think about it is, I don't know if you know have any sort of existentialist philosophy, but people like Sartre and Camus and folks like that, they sort of look at the life, look at our existence and say, what are we here? We're just sort of like, you're born, right? You don't ask to be born. You're all of a sudden thrust into this world. And then, and these existentialists tend to be sort of, yes, they didn't think there was any heaven or anything. You're just thrust in the world. You live for a little bit and you die and you're out of existence forever, right? All you have is this kind of blip of consciousness for a few years, 80 years if you're lucky, and then you're gone, right? And they seem to say, do the best you can with that, right? Do whatever you want with it. Make your life your own, right? That's all you have is your consciousness, your experience. You don't owe anybody anything. You didn't ask to be thrown into this life, and you'll be gone soon enough, right? So just make of it what you will. Right? And so, if that's your approach to life, if that's your metaphysics, then it does seem sort of like a bad use of your life, right? This one thing that you only have for a short time, for all of eternity, to just give it away to other people. So we can kind of reconstruct Ayn Rand's argument this way. Premise one: each person has only one life to live. Value the individual, then we must agree that this life is of supreme importance. I mean, all you have, it's all you are, right? Just this one life. Premise two: the ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual as something to be sacrificed for the good of others. Therefore, the ethics of altruism does not take seriously the value of the individual. But premise three, if we look at egoism, right, that does respect the value of your life. It allows you to take yourself and this precious life, the only thing that you have, take it seriously. And so, if your choice is ethical egoism or altruism, you should choose the only view that takes the individual seriously. Now, of course, there's problems with this argument. The main one being she kind of only gives you two choices, and they seem rather extreme, right? Either be an ethical egoist or you can be an altruist. But her version of altruism is like kind of extreme, right? It says there's no value at all for me, and I have to sacrifice everything for others. But isn't there kind of a third option in the middle, right? Where you say, yeah, I pursue my own interests, but also I want to right care about others, and yeah, sometimes I'll sacrifice for others, but not like. Um, so if there's a third, more reasonable option in there, then that argument doesn't work because it relies on what we call a false dichotomy. There's only two choices. One is so bad, you must choose the other one. But if there's a third one that's more attractive, the argument doesn't work. All right, here's another argument for egoism. This one tries to say that ethical egoism is common sense morality, right? That you've always been an ethical egoist, you just didn't know it. It goes something like this. Take for example, the moral prohibition on stealing, right? It's wrong to steal. Well, why do we have that rule? Um, why don't we just want to steal whenever we can? Well, think about what the world would be like if everyone stole whenever they could. Some people would make out well, but for the most of us, like that would be a terrible situation, right? I'd much rather have laws where we say we don't steal. I don't want to be out there trying to have my stuff all the time, right? Having to up or kill people to defend my house against people who are trying to steal all my stuff. That sounds terrible. I'll gladly give up, right, the right to steal from other people if it means other people will steal from me. Um, so that moral rule, don't steal, that's just a deal that everyone decided to make, and like I'm happy to make it. That's in my interest. Similarly, right? Don't harm other people. Well, yeah, I don't want to be harmed, right? And I don't want to live in a world where I have to worry about harming people. Yeah, let's make that. I'll make that deal, right? That's in my interest to say nobody harm each other. As we'll see when we get to social contract theory, Hobbes thinks that this is the basis of morality, these sort of contracts that we make, right? But for the ethical egoist, I mean, yeah, maybe it's true, right? That in general, I'd like it to be the rule that you shouldn't steal, right? But ethical egoism does seem to entail that if I can get away with it, right? Suppose in general, yeah, I want people not to steal from me, but I noticed that one of you left your laptop right in the classroom. And there's no cameras anywhere, and no one would ever know. And I could just take it, and keep whatever, $500. The ethical egoist would say, yeah, you should do that, right? It's a sort of your moral obligation to do that if you can get away with it, right? Similarly, murder, right? If you could get away with murder, and it would benefit you, then you should, right? So ethical egoism sometimes might sound like common sense morality, but there's always going to be situations where it sounds very, very different from common sense morality. Right? It sounds like immorality. Um, and it also doesn't give you all of the traditional moral rules, right? It'll give you sort of it makes sense why do not steal is in my interest. Right? But what about saving a drowning child, right? It seems like the moral thing to do if you see a child drowning is to jump in and save them, even if it would be at some risk to yourself, right? Um, but that's not like a deal that's going to benefit me. I'm not going to be a drowning child, right? Why would that be in my interest? It doesn't. Um, this this approach or this technique of trying to make egoism map onto traditional morality doesn't work for all of us. So we've seen a couple arguments for ethical egoism, and we've seen some problems with them. Let's look at some arguments against ethical egoism. The most obvious one is that ethical egoism seems to just be evil, right? Ethical egoism endorses wickedness. Um, we started to talk about in the last slide, right? If I could get away with stealing your laptop and no one would know, then ethical egoism says I should, right? But, for you, if it's your laptop that's being stolen, you would think that's just bad. You just did an immoral thing, right? Similarly, right? Ethical egoism seems to say, hey, if you could, get rich by scamming elderly people, right, with a phone or text scam, then yeah, you should do it, right? Well, that just seems bad. That just seems wrong. Um, so for some people, right, this is as straightforward a refutation of ethical egoism as you can get. Right? Ethical egoism says it's okay to murder sometimes, and that's just wrong, right? That can't be right. Um, you know, if you're a devoted ethical egoist, maybe you'll insist, right? You'll what we say, bite the bullet, right? And say, no, actually, if you can get away with it, then it's good, right? But that's my ethic. I guess so, right? Believe it if you can, I suppose. Um, in my experience, few people will agree to with that part of ethical egoism. Another argument against ethical egoism is not that it's wicked, but that it's sort of arbitrary. So we talked about this in an earlier lecture. The basis of why things like racism and sexism are wrong is because they're treating one group worse than another group for no good reason. So again, sometimes we do have to treat one person better than another, right? I will, when I grade your papers, I will treat some of you better than others, right? Because some of you will write better papers. But I'm doing it for a good reason, right? I give the better papers the better grades. Um, the reason that racism and sexism are wrong is because those aren't good reasons to treat people differently or to treat one person worse than another, right? So that's the arbitrariness of racism and sexism. So what's going on is we're all sort of abiding by what we call the principle of equal. We should treat people in the same way unless there's a good reason. And so that principle allows me to give the better papers a better grade, but it doesn't allow me to treat people differently on the basis of race or sex. Right? Um, Seems reasonable enough. So most people assume, and even racists assume this principle, right? And if you ask them, why do you think that we shouldn't treat, right, people of color as good as white people, they'll try to make up some reasons. They won't say there's no reason, right? They'll come up with some. reason that's usually a false empirical claim about, why one race is better than another. But they still, even racists seem to believe this principle of equal treatment, right? And you can tell they believe it because they try to come up with reasons. So again, it seems like everybody accepts this principle, even racists and sexists. But ethical egoism seems to violate this principle of equal treatment, not on the basis of race or sex, but on the basis of um, me and the whole rest of the world. Right? For the ethical egoists, there are two classes of people: the self and everyone who isn't me. Right? What they say is, I deserve the best treatment. Everyone else doesn't deserve my consideration at all. Right? The problem is they don't give any reason for that. Right? It's not that I'm more intelligent or better looking or more accomplished than everybody else. It's just the mere fact that it's me. The ethical egoist says I can treat myself better than everyone else because I'm me. But that seems entirely arbitrary, right? Um, so if, as we have been sort of assuming or arguing through this class, that ethical theory requires reasons, right? Moral claims require reasons to back them up. Uh, Egoism doesn't seem to have one, right? It doesn't seem to have a justification for why I'm special, why I need to be treated differently. Now, I think, if you talk to Ayn Rand about it, right, she has something to say about why the individual is very special. So I don't, this critique is foolproof, right? You could critique it using Ayn Rand's arguments, but um, it is, it's worth considering, right? And I think it's a powerful argument, even if it's even if you can possibly find a way to object to it. All right, well, that's enough out of me, and I will see you next time. We will be talking about